Today, let's talk about tuning. Tuning is an easy way to make your car reach its maximum driving capabilities. If you want to go faster without breaking the bank for a new BMW or Porsche, then tuning is the way to go. With the right type of tune on the right type of track, you can become one of the fastest racers in your area. From suspension tuning to turbochargers, this video is a complete guide on how you, yes you, can make the best version of your car. Now, this video will be accurate and useful for both real life and video games such as Forza Horizon games and Midnight Racing Tokyo. I'm also explaining all criteria in the most elaborate way possible, that way even non-car guys can understand. But if there is still any form of misunderstanding, please don't hesitate to tell me in the comments. Without wasting any more of your time, let's begin. The first criteria we'll go over is probably the most important when it comes to speed, known as gear ratios. Gear ratios are the amount of full rotations that a gear inside of a transmission can make compared to the amount of full rotations that the gear you're currently in is rotating. But for a more logical understanding of gear ratios, let's say that you're either driving on a long stretch of road before a corner, or if you're driving on a long corner preparing to turn the opposite direction towards the next hairpin. As you're driving on that straightaway or corner, does your engine seem to get louder and louder way before it's time to start downshifting and slowing down? If so, then your ratio for that gear is short, and it should be elongated, that way you can get more engine output through that straightaway or corner. Let's compare the effect of longer gears compared to shorter gears by listening to the engine. As we can see here with the shorter gears, the engine is beginning to redline at about 7,500 RPMs, but as we can see the corner and braking zone are still pretty far away. And on top of that, upshifting will cause the car's RPMs to go all the way back down to begin accelerating again, basically meaning less speed than what we had before. But let's see how long the duration of this fourth gear is if it were elongated. Notice how when this fourth gear is elongated, we were able to stretch out the duration of this gear with around the same amount of speed as the shorter gears, giving us the ability to be a little bit faster on this straightaway. The amount of elongation of your gears will depend on where the high rev zone of your car is and how far away the braking zone for the next corner is. My original fourth gear was set to 0.92, while my tuned gear was set to 1.02. It doesn't sound like a big difference, but when you're out there on the track or mountain pass, it very much so is. The second criteria we'll go over is all about cornering. After all, what's good speed without good handling? Suspension is the spring-looking part of a car behind the wheels that connect the wheels to the car itself. But it doesn't just connect the wheels to the car, it's also there to potentially absorb impact with the road when going over a bump or uneven terrain. Have you ever been driving a car or have been the passenger of one, and as the driver takes a sharp turn, the car slowly leans towards the outside of that turn? If so, then that was all of the weight of the car being shifted equally from all four tires to the two side tires on the outside. This is particularly normal for normal grocery getter cars, but it can be annoying and potentially lead to understeer if you're driving fast or racing someone. A great way to tune your suspension if this is happening is by stiffening the suspension. That way the suspension is more durable and can fight centrifugal force, aka weight, when going around a corner. Two great aftermarket suspension brands that you can rely on is Teen and Bilstein. We've just gone over how suspension can be tuned for good cornering, but suspension isn't just for turns. Just like as I said in the beginning of this criteria, suspension can also absorb an impact with the road when going over a bump or uneven terrain. Let's say that if you go over a small bump when going fast, but your car seems to have a negative after effect once you went over the bump. Symptoms of a bad after effect from a bump can be as simple as your car aggressively landing after a corner, or if your car's suspension seems to not be evening out, as if the reaction of the suspension was almost echoed, if you will. In this case, you would solve this problem by dampening your suspension. Reddit user ScoobyBJesus explains dampening downright perfectly. You know how if you were to hold a slinky, those plastic coiled up things that walk downstairs when you start it off, in the air, and let part of it fall to the ground, it will oscillate up and down before it finally comes to a rest? Car suspensions would behave the same way if there was no damping/dampening. The dampening is performed by a shock or strut. A shock or strut slows the movement of the car relative to the springs so the car doesn't continue to bounce up and down after going after a single bump. However, there's a flip side to all this talk about suspension. There are some cases where the road you frequently drive fast on is very uneven and bumpy. A great example of somewhere with roads like this is New York, which has lots of bumpy roads. If this is the case, then the road conditions may negatively affect your stiff suspension. If your road sounds like something similar, you would want to loosen your suspension, that way the springs can give the shocks more leniency when racing on these types of streets. But back to the concept of stiffening suspension for flat roads, there's one more modification you can add to your car's suspension in order to keep the car's body stable when attacking a corner. The modification is known as anti-roll bars. The name of the part itself is pretty self-explanatory, but it basically stops the car's weight from being able to roll around so much by connecting the two bottom ends of the suspension so they can react in unison. Another small tip to help reduce understeer is to loosen the anti-roll bar suspension on the front and then widen the wheel's track width. Track width is how wide the space between the wheel and the undercarriage is of a car. The good thing about track width is that you don't necessarily have to tune track width. If you just buy some wheel spacers, all you'll have to do is make sure that eventually you buy newer and more durable suspension, because spacers can potentially place additional stress on the wheel bearings, hubs, and suspension arms, which can lead to faster wear and tear. The third criteria we'll go over is all about slowing down. It's called brake bias. But before we go over what exactly brake bias is, I should go over exactly how brakes work. A brake is a mechanical system on a car that uses friction to slow a car down. This is done by the brake caliper clamping onto the circular part of the brake that spins with the wheel, known as the brake disc. When the brake caliper clamps onto the brake disc as it spins, it creates heat that is used to bring the car to a halt. There is one brake for all four wheels on a car, and when the brake pedal is pressed, all four brakes function at the same time. Brake bias is how much braking force is split between the front and rear brakes. The average brake bias on a sports car is typically around 60 to 70% on the front, while leaving about 30 to 40% on the rear. Tuning your brake bias is useful because it gives you more control of your car as it's slowing down. Most people make sure that their brake bias is set to have a lot more force on the front than the rear, because it gives the center of gravity that's pushed all towards the front when braking more aggressiveness. But make sure that when you do tune brake bias, don't put too much on the front, because then the braking force will work too well and then lock up the wheel, which will cause you to understeer even more. There's two tuning types that not many people talk about, but should be mentioned more. The first one is called weight reduction. Just as it sounds, weight reduction is to take out as many unnecessary parts of a car as possible, which will in turn make the car lighter and improve its performance in many ways like speed, cornering, and acceleration. It doesn't even matter what type of racing you do with your car, whether it's grip racing, toge racing, drifting, or just a simple track day, weight reduction will definitely come in handy for the betterment of your car. But stripping out the entire interior of your car isn't always the route you need to take. Sometimes it can be as easy as just replacing a part with a new one made out of carbon fiber, or changing your seat to a bucket seat made by a company like Recaro or Brid. By the way, it's pronounced Brid, not Bride. The second type is aerodynamics. You've probably heard this word many times before, but never knew the meaning. Aerodynamics is the way the air flows around and over a moving object. The ideal form of aerodynamics on a car is to have the front going downwards towards an acute angle, that way the air that builds up in front of a car when driving can reach the top easier. Lamborghinis are a perfect example of peak aerodynamics due to literally every car they've ever made having that iconic sloped front end. This is what most aftermarket body kit companies try to aim for, but usually they don't have the resources to make the parts like that, nor do they really want the resources, because let's be real here, no one wants a weird door stopper shaped front end on their car. But an alternative to have good aerodynamics is to give your car a front splitter or an aftermarket wing to increase downforce. Also, a lot of people don't know this, but wings and spoilers are actually two different things. A wing is a small plank of carbon fiber usually held up by metal beams to create better airflow, while spoilers are actually the small rear lip you may see on cars. A wing is used to create downforce, while spoilers are designed to reduce lift on the rear. But just like all forms of tuning, you don't want too much of everything because it can affect your car in the wrong ways. Say you're going down a long straightaway followed by a hill. You don't want to end up like Mark Webber on June 12th and 13th of 1999. So we've gone over the 5 main aspects and criteria of tuning, but there's one last main part of tuning that I'd like to talk about, that being the tires. We probably all know what tires are, but other than protecting the rim from being scratched and destroyed, what are they useful for? Well, they're incredibly important for giving the wheels some form of traction. The treads on the tire press onto the ground, and as the tire keeps quickly spinning, the treads picking up on the road are making friction, which in turn causes heat, and heat creates stickiness on the rubber, which will make good traction for the tires. Different types of tires like soft, hard, and slick tires will give you different types of grip, and the amount of air pressure inside the tire will affect exactly how the tires act. But I must warn everyone, if you're someone who's constantly going to a track or course and doing things that strain the tires a lot like trail braking and slip angle, then I would say to start budgeting how much you're spending on the tires. Because depending on what brand you buy, tires can get very expensive. Now see, you'd think $206 is pretty cheap for a set of tires, but this is just for one tire. If you add up all 4 tires, you're paying a total cost of $827 per tires. Think about it like this. You're going to the track practically every weekend for hours on end, wearing out your tires every time. Oh, and don't get me started on the drift days. That means you'll be paying about $800 every weekend, which comes to $3,200 a month. Just as my dad said when talking to him about this topic, you've chosen a very expensive hobby. Okay, the second part of tuning isn't really something I talk about much because I believe that you don't always have to increase a car's horsepower in order to make it faster. The second part is simply putting actual aftermarket parts on your car to increase horsepower. There are tons of parts out there like turbochargers, which send more air to the engine and increases acceleration, intakes, which provide oxygen for the engine, and many more parts for you to choose from. In fact, there's an entire show that happens every year in Las Vegas, Nevada, known as SEMA, which shows off all of the best performance parts of the year. If you'd like to find out more about SEMA, then you can watch a video I made about it linked in the description. Now, as I was saying about how certain performance parts aren't necessary depending on what type of track or course you're on, we can use turbochargers as an example. As Ryosuke Takahashi from Initial D said, they're like a double-edged sword. Sure, turbochargers are great on the straightaways, but when you're coming out of the corners, it can seriously hinder the car's behavior. When the straightaways are shorter, the more powerful car doesn't always have the advantage. Sometimes it just comes down to who's more aggressive, which is why Keisuke's turbo, clearly the faster car, had the opposite effect. Or something like that, he said. In a nutshell, this means that the amount of time you have to use all your turbo's power is incredibly short because you'll have to slow down for the next turn, and then it'll take a long time to accelerate once you exit the corner because all the turbo's extra force has to reaccumulate. Now, if we're talking about drag tuning, then yes, by all means, a turbo is amazing all the way around because there's no point in slowing down until you've crossed the finish line. Personally, a small quote I made specifically for this criteria is to aim for power, not horsepower. Inexperienced tuners probably won't understand what I mean, but once you've gotten used to how tuning works and how it functions, you'll see what I mean. The final criteria we'll go over today for this video is not actually tuning for more power, it's for more control. No, not by stiffening the suspension or changing the tires, but by resetting or lowering the amount of tuning done to your build. This is known as detuning. Just as I said with the functions of turbos, all the power those upgrades or tuning settings give you aren't always a necessity for what you're trying to do. If you have too much horsepower, sometimes the car can in a way know the extent of its capabilities, so it tries to perform at that maximum potential, but when it does that, it can be a disadvantage for your type of driving style. Again, it's one of those things that experienced tuners will relate to a lot. Alright, now after 12 minutes of yapping about changing the settings and parts of a car, I think we're about finished with knowing everything that's necessary about tuning. If there's anything you should take away from this video, let it be that if you're going to tune, make sure it's done by a company that truly knows what they're doing. Don't let it just be some basic mechanic shop in the hood. Let it be a company that actually has a name for itself, like Evans Tuning, located in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, Soho Motors, located in Charlotte, North Carolina, or if you'd really like to get crazy with it, fly over to Japan and get your car tuned by legendary car community members like Smokey Nagata, who owns a shop in Chiba. If you have a Honda, then maybe you can take it to a shop known as Spoon Sports, located in Tokyo. And yes, Spoon Sports is the same company that Brian mentioned in the Fast and the Furious. Anyway, if there's any further questions you have about tuning, then again, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments of this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hope to see you on the next one.